The fluorescent light above interrogation room 3 had been flickering for 6 months. Nobody had fixed it. Nobody would. The door was still swinging on its hinges when Miller's ring connected with Sarah Chen's left cheek. The sound wasn't loud. That was the worst part. It was small and private, like something being quietly decided. Sarah's head turned with it. Her hand came up a half-second late, palm pressed flat against the bruise already forming beneath her eye, and she stood very still the way people stand when they are trying not to give anyone the satisfaction of watching them fall. The precinct floor beyond the glass partition did not stop. Keyboards kept clicking. A radio murmured. Officer Marcus Reed looked down at the report on his desk and did not look up. The front doors opened. Kenji Sato did not rush. He never did. He stepped into the precinct the way a man steps into a room he already owns the deed to, paused for exactly 3 seconds at the threshold, and read the space, the layout of desks, the position of the cameras, the exact window of interrogation room 3 where a woman in a waitress uniform stood holding her own face together. He walked to the public waiting bench along the east wall, sat, straightened one cuff. A young desk clerk, Ramirez, her name badge said, appeared in front of him, her pen hovering uncertainly over her notepad. "Sir, do you have an appointment?" "I'm waiting," Kenji said. That was all. His voice had no weather in it. No warmth, no cold, just the flat certainty of a man who had learned long ago that silence was the loudest thing in any room. Through the glass, Miller adjusted his badge with the thumb of the hand he had just used. He turned, scanning the floor with the ease of a man who had never once imagined consequences, and found Kenji Sato looking back at him. Not staring, not threatening, looking, the way an architect looks at a building he is about to redesign from the foundation up. Miller's jaw tightened. "You need something." Kenji held his gaze for one breath, two. Then he looked back at the interrogation room window, where Sarah Chen was still standing, still holding her face, still waiting for someone in this building to remember that their job was to protect her. "Not yet," Kenji said. Miller closed the interrogation room door the way men like him closed everything, like the act itself was a warning. He didn't sit. Sitting would have put him at eye level with Sarah, and Miller hadn't been at eye level with anyone in this precinct for 11 years. He stood at the corner of the table, one hand resting on the back of the empty chair across from her, fingers drumming a slow, patient rhythm against the metal. Sarah kept her hands folded in her lap. The bruise beneath her eye had deepened to the color of a late sky. She did not touch it again. "You're a smart woman," Miller said. "I've always thought that about you." He said it the way people say things they don't mean, smoothly, without friction, the way a stone skips across water before it sinks. "My son made a mistake." He moved around the table slowly, not toward her, just around it, filling the room with himself the way smoke fills a room gradually, then completely. "Young men make mistakes. That's what being young is. You understand that. You have a daughter." Sarah's hands tightened in her lap. She said nothing. "Lily," he let the name sit in the air between them. 11 years old, waiting on a surgery list. He shook his head with the practiced sadness of a man performing sympathy. "Medical costs the way they are right now. It would be a shame if the paperwork got complicated. Insurance disputes, billing errors, those things take months to sort out." The fluorescent light above them flickered once. "All I need," Miller continued, pulling out the chair and finally sitting across from her, eye level now because he had chosen it, because choice was the point, "is for you to remember that night the way I remember it. A car, dark street. You weren't wearing your glasses, were you? Visibility was poor. Accidents happen." Sarah looked at him, not through him, not past him, at him, the way someone looks when they are memorizing a face for later. "Your son hit a 16-year-old boy," she said. Her voice was quiet. It did not shake. "He drove away." Miller's expression didn't change. That was the tell, the absolute stillness of a man who had already decided the outcome of a conversation before it began. "That boy is fine," he said. "He has a fractured pelvis." "He is fine." The word landed like a fist on a table. Final, administrative. "And you..." He leaned forward slightly, just slightly, enough to reduce the air between them, are a widowed waitress with a sick daughter and a lease that's up in 60 days. So I need you to think very carefully about what kind of trouble you can actually afford. He stood, smoothed his uniform. Take your time, he said. You've got until tomorrow morning. He left the door open behind him. The rain that night had been the kind that didn't fall so much as settle. A cold, persistent weight pressing the city down into itself. Kenji was 17 and bleeding from a place below his ribs that he couldn't afford to look at. He had made 3 mistakes that evening. He had cataloged them even then, methodically, the way he would later catalog everything: debts, names, the precise moment a man's loyalty shifts. The first mistake had brought him to the alley. The second had kept him there too long. The third was bleeding through his fingers onto wet concrete. He had not called for help. Calling for help was a fourth mistake he refused to make. The back door of the diner opened and a man stepped out carrying a trash bag. He stopped when he saw Kenji. Most people in that alley at that hour would have stepped back inside and turned the lock. Kenji had expected exactly that. He had already begun calculating how far he could walk before his legs stopped cooperating. The man dropped the bag, crouched down, pressed 2 clean dish towels, still warm from the dryer, hard against Kenji's side without asking a single question about how or why. Hold that, the man said. Both hands press like you mean it. His name was David Chen. Kenji learned that later. That night he was just a pair of steady hands and a calm voice on a phone, talking to someone at a private clinic 3 blocks over, using the kind of careful language that meant no police, no paperwork, just come. He stayed until they arrived. He didn't ask for anything. He didn't warn Kenji about the life he was clearly living or offer the speech that men in alleys at 17 are supposed to receive. He simply stayed, one hand on Kenji's shoulder, until someone else could take over the weight. Why? Kenji had asked, just before they moved him. David Chen had looked at him the way very few people had ever looked at Kenji. Without calculation, without fear, without the particular wariness that his face tended to produce in people even then. You looked like you needed one person, David said simply. Tonight, I'm that person. 22 years later, Kenji sat in the back of a black car parked across from the precinct and watched the footage on his phone for the 3rd time. 12 seconds. The flicker of Miller's ring. Sarah's head turning with it, her hand coming up too late. David Chen had been in the ground for 4 years. Kenji set the phone face down on the seat beside him and looked out at the precinct's lit windows. The ordinary, fluorescent indifference of the place. He thought about a rainy alley, 2 warm dish towels, the specific weight of a hand on his shoulder that had asked for absolutely nothing in return. He picked up his phone, made one call. Clear my week, he said. The timestamp in the corner of the footage read 11:47 p.m. Marcus watched it twice before he understood what he was seeing. Then he watched it 4 more times because he kept hoping the understanding would change. It didn't. The interrogation room camera had a fixed angle, wide enough to catch the table, both chairs, the full length of the east wall. Wide enough to catch Miller's ring hand coming up and across in a motion that was not a mishap, was not a stumble, was not the accident that the incident report on Marcus's desk described in 3 careful, passive-voice sentences. Contact was made. The subject lost her footing. Medical attention was offered and declined. Marcus sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling. He was 29 years old. He had wanted to be a police officer since he was 9, since the year Officer Briggs had walked him home through the east side after a group of older boys had taken his bike and left him standing on a corner not knowing which direction led back to somewhere safe. He had held onto that image for 20 years, the specific shape of what it meant to be the person who walked someone home. He looked back at the screen. Miller wasn't walking anyone home. Marcus ejected the drive, turned it over in his fingers. Standard department tissue. One of 6 cameras in the building that fed to the central archive on the 3rd floor, managed by a system that Miller had personally overseen upgrading 18 months ago, which meant Miller knew exactly what the cameras caught and exactly what they didn't. What he apparently hadn't accounted for was Camera 4, the auxiliary unit mounted in the hallway outside Interrogation Room 3, installed 6 weeks ago as part of a citywide infrastructure review, and not yet fully integrated into the central system. It fed to a separate terminal in the equipment room on the ground floor. A room that nobody visited because it smelled like old copper, and the coffee machine on that floor had been broken since February. Marcus had only been in there because he'd left his jacket. He turned the drive over again. 11 years ago, Miller had written the recommendation letter that got Marcus his position, had shaken his hand at the graduation ceremony, had told him, "This job gets heavy, son. You lean on the people next to you." The people next to Marcus right now were looking at their boots. The same boots they'd studied during Sarah Chen's humiliation on the precinct floor. A room full of officers who had decided, collectively and without discussion, that what they hadn't seen couldn't require them to act. Marcus understood it. That was the part that frightened him most, how completely he understood it. He opened his desk drawer, placed the drive inside, closed it. Then he sat with his hands flat on his desk and listened to the precinct move around him like a river that had learned to flow around a particular stone, and wondered how long a stone could hold before the water won. Nobody announced it. That was the point. The first thing to go was the parking lot. 3 blocks east of the precinct sat a privately owned lot that charged the city's posted rate to everyone, except a rotating roster of off-duty officers who parked free, every shift, in exchange for the kind of selective blindness that kept the lot's back corner transactions undisturbed. The arrangement was 11 years old. It had survived 2 precinct captains, 1 federal audit, and a city council rezoning initiative. It survived until a Tuesday morning when the lot's owner, a compact, nervous man named Ortega who had never once been late on his informal payments to Miller's intermediary, arrived to find a letter of acquisition on his front gate. The building company listed had 17 subsidiaries. None of them traced back anywhere interesting on the first search, or the second, or the 5th. Ortega called the number he had for emergencies. It rang out. He tried again. Same result. By noon, the lot had new management. By Thursday, the back corner transactions had relocated, and found, consistently, that wherever they relocated, the welcome lasted exactly 48 hours before something changed. A lease, a ownership transfer, a health inspection with unusual thoroughness. Miller didn't hear about the lot until Wednesday. He heard about the pattern on Friday, from a man named Cass who managed 3 of the precinct's unofficial arrangements, and who arrived at Miller's office door with the particular expression of someone delivering news they wish belonged to someone else. "It's coordinated," Cass said. "Everything's coordinated," Miller told him. "Kids coordinate, it doesn't mean anything." "Sergeant," Cass set a folder on the desk. Inside were 5 acquisition notices, 2 lease terminations, and a copy of a noise complaint filed against a card game that had run quietly in the back of a laundromat on Deering Street for 9 years. In 6 days. Miller looked at the folder without touching it. The card game alone generated enough monthly revenue to cover 3 car payments, 2 tuition installments for his son's law school applications, and a quarterly payment to a city records clerk who had been keeping certain files misfiled for the better part of a decade. He closed the folder. Find out who. "We're trying to." Find out who? His voice had dropped to the register he used when he needed people to understand that a conversation was finished. Quietly, nothing on paper. Cass nodded and left. Miller sat alone for a moment. Then he pulled Sarah Chen's file from the corner of his desk where it had been waiting since Wednesday morning, still unsigned, the charges still pending, her fate still a decision he hadn't yet committed to paper. He thought about the man in the black suit on the public bench, the one who had looked at him through the glass like a man reading the final page of a book he'd already finished. He picked up his pen. Then he set it down again. Outside his window, the city moved through its ordinary Friday, indifferent and unhurried, while somewhere in it, quietly and without announcement, another domino stood up and waited to fall. The diner was quietest between 2 and 4 in the afternoon. Sarah had always liked that window, the lunch rush gone, the dinner crowd not yet assembled, the whole place settling into itself like a held breath. She could think during those hours, could move between tables without navigating anyone's urgency, refilling salt shakers and folding napkins in the particular silence that belonged only to empty restaurants and early mornings. She was refolding the same napkin for the 3rd time when the bell above the door announced him. She knew before she looked up. Something in the way the room's atmosphere shifted, the way it does when a presence enters that is accustomed to changing rooms simply by occupying them. She turned, and there was Kenji Sato, standing at the threshold of her diner in a charcoal suit that had no business being within 3 blocks of a laminate countertop. He sat at the counter, the same unhurried arrangement of himself she had witnessed through the interrogation room glass, except closer now, real in a way that the glass had softened. Sarah brought him coffee without being asked. She wasn't sure why. Muscle memory, maybe, or something else. The instinct of a woman who had learned to read rooms and had read this one correctly. He waited until she had set the cup down before he spoke. "You knew my husband," she said. She hadn't planned to say it first. It came out anyway. Kenji looked at her. "He never told you about me." "No, but you have his way of sitting." She leaned against the counter across from him, arms folded, not defensive, settled. "Like the chair belongs to you, but you're not in any hurry to prove it." Something moved briefly across Kenji's face. Not quite a smile. The memory of one, maybe. "I owe David a debt," he said. "I've carried it for 22 years. I intend to settle it." "I'm not a debt." "No," he agreed immediately. "You're not." He turned the coffee cup once in its saucer, a slow rotation, considering. "Miller will file the charges by Monday if he believes you have no one. His entire leverage depends on your isolation, on you remaining exactly what this city has always treated you as, a woman whose disappearance from a situation causes no disruption to anyone who matters." Sarah was quiet for a moment. Through the diner window, the afternoon moved past in its ordinary way. A bus, 2 schoolchildren, a man walking a dog that had stopped to investigate something invisible in the sidewalk. "And if I'm not alone?" she asked. Kenji looked at her directly then, not the way Miller looked at her, which was the look of a man measuring what he could take. This was something else entirely. Recognition, maybe. The specific regard of someone who sees a person whole. "Then Miller is no longer dealing with a waitress," Kenji said. "He is dealing with me." He reached into his jacket and placed a card on the counter. No name, just a number. "You are no longer invisible, Sarah." He left the coffee untouched, and the exact cost of it, plus $20, folded beneath the saucer. She didn't check the amount until after he was gone. It was enough to cover Lily's medication for the month. The parking garage on Clement Street lost its top 2 floors to a structural review 3 years ago and never recovered the foot traffic. Level 2 sat mostly empty after 6, which was why Marcus had chosen it, and which meant that when he heard the single set of footsteps ascending the ramp at 8:47 p.m., he knew exactly who they belonged to before the figure stepped into the amber wash of the one working overhead light. Kenji Sato dressed for a parking garage the same way he dressed for everything else. Like the location was the one making the adjustment. Marcus had the drive in his jacket pocket. He had put it there that morning, taken it out twice, returned it both times. He had eaten nothing since lunch. He had written and deleted a message to his mother that said only, "I think I'm about to do something," and had not been able to finish the sentence in any direction that felt honest. Kenji stopped 6 feet away and waited. Marcus was already understanding. A man who had mastered the particular patience of someone who knew the other person would eventually reach the same conclusion he already had. "How did you know about the camera?" Marcus asked. "I know about most things," Kenji said. "Eventually." "That's not an answer." "No," Kenji agreed. "It isn't." He looked at Marcus with the same unhurried attention he seemed to give everything. "You've been carrying that drive for 4 days. You haven't slept well. You arrived at the precinct 40 minutes early this morning and sat in your car for 37 of them. Marcus said nothing. You already made this decision, Kenji continued. You made it the night you went back to the equipment room and copied the file. Everything since then has been you waiting to catch up to yourself. The amber light hummed above them. Somewhere below, a car moved through level 1 and exited, its tail lights bleeding briefly red against the concrete before disappearing. Marcus thought about the recommendation letter, about the graduation handshake, about a room full of officers studying their boots, while a woman in a waitress uniform held her own face together and waited for one person to remember what the job was supposed to mean. He thought about Officer Briggs walking him home through the east side, the specific shape of that, what it had cost Briggs nothing, what it had meant everything. He pulled the drive from his pocket. Miller will know it was me, Marcus said. Miller will be otherwise occupied, Kenji replied. That's also not an answer. No, Kenji took the drive with the careful, unhurried motion of a man receiving something he understands the full weight of. But it's the truth. Marcus stood with his empty hand at his side and felt the specific lightness of a thing set down after being carried too long in the wrong direction. Will she be all right? He asked. Sarah Chen. Kenji placed the drive inside his jacket, smoothed the lapel. She will be better than all right, he said. Go home, Officer Reed, sleep. For the first time in 4 days, Marcus thought he actually might. It began, as most precise things do, with paperwork. At 11:03 p.m. on a Thursday, a courier delivered a formally bound legal notice to the private residence of Captain Gerald Oakes, the precinct's commanding officer, a man who had spent 14 years carefully not knowing the specific details of Miller's arrangements while benefiting, in general and unexamined ways, from their outcomes. The notice was from a firm with a name that occupied a full line and a half of the envelope's return address. It cited 4 federal statutes, 1 municipal code, and requested the preservation of all internal records, communications, and security archives dating back 11 years, pending a civil rights investigation filed on behalf of one Sarah Chen. Captain Oakes read it twice in his doorway, in his bathrobe, and then sat down on his front steps without fully deciding to. At 11:31 p.m., a separate team, 3 forensic accountants and a data analyst who had flown in from a city that wasn't asked about, established a working perimeter in a rented office Suite 6 blocks from the precinct. They had subpoenas for the financial records of 11 shell accounts, 4 property management companies, and 1 parking lot acquisition that had been improperly logged as a city infrastructure asset in the municipal database 2 years prior. They worked without speaking much. Professionals in a particular field rarely need to narrate what they're doing to each other. By midnight, 2 of Miller's intermediaries had received calls from their own attorneys they hadn't contacted, who had nonetheless been fully briefed on situations their clients hadn't disclosed to anyone. The calls were brief. The message in each was the same, worded differently but arriving at an identical destination. The structure you have been standing on is no longer load-bearing. Act accordingly. Cass, the man who managed Miller's arrangements and who had delivered the folder of acquisition notices 5 days prior, left his apartment at 12:44 a.m. carrying 1 bag. He did not return. Miller's son's incident report, the original, unedited version, the one that had never been formally filed, surfaced in the secure inbox of a federal prosecutor at 1:15 a.m., accompanied by a chain of custody document so immaculate it appeared to have been prepared by people who had been anticipating this exact moment for some time. Because they had. Kenji sat in the rented office suite and did not touch a single document. He didn't need to. He had learned long ago that the most effective kind of power was the kind that arranged consequences so thoroughly in advance that its own presence at the final moment was almost ceremonial. He watched his team work and thought about Miller sitting in his office on Friday, picking up a pen and setting it back down. A man who had spent 11 years mistaking the silence of people around him for the absence of anyone watching. Kenji understood silence better than most. He had been watching for 4 years. He poured himself water from a glass on the corner of the desk and waited patiently for morning. Kenji arrived at shift change, deliberately. Shift change was the precinct at its most human, tired people handing the world to less tired people, coats coming off, coats going on, the brief overlap when both shifts occupied the same space, and the chain of command softened at its joints. It was also the moment when the building held the most witnesses. He came with 4 lawyers and said nothing to any of them as they crossed the parking lot. They knew what to do. They had rehearsed in the way that very prepared people rehearse, not by running through steps, but by understanding the objective so completely that the steps arranged themselves. The precinct floor went quiet in a particular sequence. The officers nearest the door first, then the ones at their desks who read the room before they read the situation, then finally the ones in the back who looked up from whatever they were doing and found the silence had already arrived without them. Kenji walked to the center of the floor and stopped. One of the lawyers, a composed woman named Park who had argued before 3 federal courts and had the particular stillness of someone who found chaos organizationally interesting, stepped to the front desk and placed a document on the counter with the flat, final sound of something being permanently recorded. "We have federal preservation orders covering this facility's records, communications, and security systems effective immediately," she said. "We also have 3 arrest warrants and a court order suspending the active duty status of Sergeant Dale Miller pending investigation. If anyone in this building obstructs the service of these documents, I have the United States Attorney's Office on a call that has been running for the last 4 minutes." She set her phone on the counter, screen up. Nobody moved. Miller appeared from the corridor behind the main desk. He had heard something in the quality of the silence that had reached even his office, the specific acoustic signature of a room full of people deciding, collectively and without discussion, to stand very still. He saw Kenji. For a moment, a single, visible moment, something moved across Miller's face that had never been there before. Not fear exactly, the precursor to it. The recognition that arrives just before the full understanding does. "You have no authority here," Miller said. "No," Kenji agreed, his voice carried without effort across the silent floor. "But they do," he indicated Park. "And they do." 2 federal agents stepped through the entrance behind him, credentials already extended. "And as of 40 minutes ago, so does the United States Attorney for this district." He let that arrange itself in the room. Then he looked at Miller the way he had looked at him through the glass doors on the first day, with the patient, finished attention of a man who had already read the final page. "Badge 412, Kenji said quietly. "Take it off." One by one, the officers along the back wall stepped away from Miller. Not dramatically, not with any announcement, simply a series of small adjustments, a shifted weight, a half-step sideways, the blue wall, dismantling itself one person at a time in the fluorescent silence of a Thursday morning. Miller's hand went to his badge, stayed there. Marcus Reed, standing at his desk in the back of the room, watched it happen and finally, after 11 days of not knowing which direction led back to somewhere safe, felt the specific relief of a man who had made the right choice before he fully understood he was making it. The hospital corridor smelled like antiseptic and recycled air, and the particular stillness of a place where people wait for news that will divide their lives into before and after. Sarah sat in a plastic chair outside the pre-op suite and held Lily's hand until the exact moment she couldn't anymore. Until the orderly appeared, and the gurney began to move, and Lily turned her head back to look at her mother with the specific trust of a child who has learned, from watching her mother, that fear and courage are not opposites, but traveling companions. "I'll be right here," Sarah told her. Lily nodded once, satisfied, and let the corridor take her. Sarah sat back down, folded her hands in her lap the way she had folded them in the interrogation room, not from defeat this time, but from the habit of a woman who had learned to hold herself together by keeping her hands still when everything else moved. The surgery had been scheduled for 11 weeks. The trust that covered it had been established 9 days ago by a legal entity whose paperwork was impeccable, and whose origin, if traced through the correct sequence of holding companies, eventually arrived at a name that meant nothing to the hospital's billing department and everything to Sarah. She had not asked Kenji about the money directly. When she had tried at the diner 3 days after the shutdown, he had looked at her with that same unhurried regard and said only, "David would have done it for mine." She had understood then that the conversation was finished and that no further accounting between them was necessary. Some debts, settled honestly, close quietly. The apron was in her bag. She had worn it for the last time that morning, had arrived at the diner at 6 as always, started the coffee as always, begun the opening side work with the same muscle memory that had carried her through 4 years of double shifts and tired feet, and the specific loneliness of a woman working too hard to have time to feel how hard she was working. Then she had reached the moment when the first customer would normally have arrived, and instead she had untied the apron, folded it across the counter, and stood in the empty diner for a full minute, doing nothing. Just standing, taking up space, being visible in a room without needing to serve it. She had put the apron in her bag because leaving it on the counter had felt too much like an ending, and she wasn't ready, quite yet, to let the ending be something she'd walked away from without carrying briefly with her. The weight of it mattered. The putting down of it would matter more. Outside the surgery ward's window, the city moved through its ordinary morning. A bus, pigeons reorganizing themselves on a wire, a woman in a yellow coat walking fast against the wind with the purposeful forward lean of someone who knows exactly where she is going. Sarah watched her and felt, for the first time in longer than she could locate, the quiet return of a feeling she had nearly forgotten the shape of. Not happiness exactly, something steadier than that. The sense that the next chapter of her life belonged entirely to her, and that she was, at last, ready to begin it. 2 hours and 40 minutes later, a surgeon appeared at the end of the corridor with a calm face and open hands, and Sarah Chen stood up to meet him.